Can you believe one of China's closest economic partners has been secretly training troops in Taiwan for nearly 50 years? It's not the US, not Japan, not South Korea, but Singapore. This tiny city-state officially supports Beijing's One China policy, but it still sends thousands of soldiers to train in the breakaway Chinese province every year. Now imagine a Taiwan Strait war breaking out tomorrow. Would Singapore stay neutral? Would the US intervene? Would Japan join in? Or would Asia split into rival camps overnight? Because if conflict erupts, it won't just be about Taiwan. It could redraw the entire balance of power in Asia, and decide whether China's reunification happens peacefully or by force. Because if conflict erupts, it won't just be about Taiwan. It could redraw the entire balance of power in Asia, and decide whether China's reunification happens peacefully or by force. Welcome to Difference Frames the World, a channel that breaks down the global power shifts shaping the 21st century, especially the strategic rivalry between China and the Western world, with a focus on the United States. We go beyond headlines. Here, geopolitics isn't just about daily news. It's about long-term strategy, civilizational memory, economic leverage, military balance, supply chains, critical minerals, the Belt and Road Initiative, Asia-Pacific strategy, rare earth dominance, technological competition, and the future world order. Subscribe to our channel, enable notifications, and get our daily uploads. Today, let's start with a surprising piece of history that many people outside of Asia might not know. Singapore has been quietly training troops in Taiwan for over 5 decades, since 1975, through a bilateral arrangement called the Starlight Program, or Project Starlight. Under this program, Singapore's military rotates thousands of soldiers every year through Taiwanese training camps, using terrain that resembles parts of Southeast Asia, and conducting exercises that its tiny island can't host. Because Singapore lacks space for large-scale exercises at home, and because it carefully balances relationships with both China and the West. It's an arrangement that has survived international pressures, and it tells you a lot about Singapore's unique foreign policy position in a world where the tension between Beijing and Taipei has become one of the most dangerous flashpoints in global geopolitics. Now, Singapore doesn't have formal diplomatic relations with Taiwan. In fact, it officially recognizes Beijing's One China policy, just like most of the world. But unlike many countries that go out of their way to avoid any military ties with Taiwan, Singapore has kept this training cooperation alive in part because it serves Singapore's own defense needs, for it doesn't have room at home for large-scale troop training. And in part because Singapore has always tried very hard to balance relationships with China and the West. Maintaining ties with both sides is a way to preserve its freedom to act independently, rather than being pushed into one camp or another. Let's imagine, for a moment, that things go off the rails in the Taiwan Strait. Over the past few years, Beijing's military has been conducting major drills around Taiwan, increasingly large in scale, and aimed at simulating blockades and joint operations. In late 2025, China staged Justice Mission 2025, a massive exercise encircling Taiwan with warships, fighter jets, missiles, and drones, disrupting civilian flights and showing off capabilities that many analysts say are meant to deter outside interference, especially from the United States and Japan. In response, Taiwan has stepped up its own defensive posture, and the US, even without formal diplomatic ties, has deepened its military cooperation with Taipei. That already sets the stage for a very complicated crisis scenario if tensions escalate further. Here's where Singapore fits into this possible future. It's not a big nuclear superpower, and it doesn't have formal defense obligations to Taiwan as the US believes it does, under its legal framework of various security laws and arms sales, despite Washington's repeated denial of supporting the Taiwan independence fervor. Singapore isn't part of a mutual defense treaty with Taiwan. But its long-standing training cooperation puts it in a uniquely awkward and potentially strategically significant position if a conflict ever breaks out. To understand that, imagine a blockade scenario. Military planners in the region have simulated such an event. In a 2025 war game held in Singapore, it became clear that Singapore could serve as a critical evacuation hub for hundreds of thousands of Southeast Asian citizens trapped on Taiwan in a crisis. That game didn't involve firing a shot, It was about logistics, evacuation planning, and diplomatic coordination, but it highlighted Singapore's operational potential because of its geography, airfield capacity, and networks. Now, Singapore's leaders will be the first to tell you they don't want war. Their official stance has always been one of neutrality and diplomatic balance. But neutrality doesn't mean being irrelevant. In fact, there's a paradox here. Sometimes the more you're integrated into a region's pre-crisis planning, the more you matter when tensions boil over. And Singapore has been quietly doing that for years, training its soldiers under international spotlight, hosting regional dialogues, maintaining defense dialogue with China, and positioning itself as a trusted partner for many countries. It's a form of strategic hedging. But let's get real about the risks. Singapore's military presence in Taiwan, while relatively small in absolute numbers, with merely a few thousand troops rotating annually, could become a serious problem if war breaks out. China regards any foreign military cooperation with Taiwan as interference in what Beijing considers a domestic matter to be resolved under its One China principle. An attack on Singaporean forces on the island could easily be treated by China as a direct intervention by a foreign power, even if Singapore's soldiers are technically training, not fighting. That ambiguity alone could be enough to broaden a conflict beyond the strait. China might calculate that targeting Singaporean forces would provoke a stronger response from the US, which has deep military ties with the latter, including ship visits and surveillance cooperation. That raises questions about what the US would do in such a scenario. And here's where things get really messy. The United States is legally and politically committed to helping Taiwan defend itself. That doesn't mean Washington would automatically go to war over Taiwan, as the long-standing U.S. policy of strategic ambiguity keeps potential responses deliberately unclear to avoid emboldening either side. But the U.S. has been supplying more weapons, deepening training, and signaling that it takes Taiwan's security seriously. If China tries a blockade or reignites the civil war that has not ended since 1949, the U.S. might see it as a direct threat to its interests and to regional stability. A Chinese attack that targets or traps foreign troops, even neutral ones like Singapore's, could make it very difficult for Washington to stay on the sidelines. That doesn't mean absolute certainty of intervention, but it raises the political and strategic stakes enormously. Then there's Japan. Tokyo isn't formally allied with Taiwan, either, but Japan sees Beijing's forcible takeover of Taiwan as a direct threat to its own security. Taiwan sits right across the East China Sea, and if Beijing controlled both Taiwan and those waters, Japan would face a Chinese military directly adjacent to its southwestern islands, potentially cutting off its supply routes and isolating the country strategically. Japan's leaders have been more vocal in recent years about the need to support Taiwan's self-defense, and to work more closely with the U.S. to deter the Chinese mainland. It's conceivable that in a crisis, Japan could provide logistical support, intelligence, and even joint defensive operations. Still, it's also mindful of public opinion, constitutional constraints on military action, and the devastating legacy of war in Japan's history. Any intervention would likely be calibrated, limited, and carefully couched in terms of collective defense with the U.S., rather than a unilateral decision by Tokyo. But the possibility is there, and China certainly considers it when planning its own strategies. Back in Southeast Asia, most countries want to avoid being dragged into a war they don't directly benefit from. In a conflict, nations like Indonesia, Vietnam, and the Philippines would focus on evacuating their citizens and avoiding disruptions to trade and shipping, rather than rushing to fight. That's especially true given that China is a major economic partner for all of them, and Beijing has incentives to keep ASEAN countries neutral or at least not openly hostile. Analysts have pointed out that China would likely put a high priority on evacuating Southeast Asian nationals from Taiwan quickly in a crisis to protect its diplomatic posture in the region. In other words, Beijing knows that if smaller neighbors feel attacked or threatened, they could tilt toward Washington's camp, so Beijing tries to avoid that perception, even as it pressures Taiwan militarily. So what does Singapore's role in this possible future add up to? On paper, Singapore isn't a frontline combatant. It doesn't have defense treaties that would automatically draw it into a shooting war. But its military cooperation with Taiwan gives it a stake in the game, and its economic integration with China gives it a strong incentive to avoid war. That's a tightrope walk that Singapore has been walking for decades, and it's a hard one. If conflict breaks out in the Taiwan Strait, Singapore's actions could help determine the shape of that conflict. Whether it remains localized, expands into a broader regional confrontation, or generates enough pressure from all sides to force a negotiated freeze rather than an outright war. And what about China's ambitions for reunification? Beijing has repeatedly said that it wants Taiwan to rejoin the mainland peacefully, but it has never renounced the use of force if it deems peaceful efforts exhausted. The drills around Taiwan, including simulated encirclements and blockades, are as much about signaling to Washington and Taipei as they are about training the PLA. Suppose Beijing believes the window to achieve its objectives is closing, whether because of Taiwan's growing defense ties with the US or internal political factors, it might feel pressured to act sooner rather than later. That's a terrifying prospect because once military action starts, it's incredibly hard to control escalation. A blockade could quickly lead to miscalculation, the shooting down of aircraft, the sinking of ships, or an attack on foreign personnel. Then the conflict could look very different from anything planned on paper. In an ideal world, none of this plays out. Diplomats hammer out agreements, confidence-building measures lower tensions, and both sides find a way to manage competition without war. But increasing military activity, rising nationalist rhetoric, and a crowded field of interested parties make that ideal seem increasingly tenuous. Singapore's role in this story is both small in scale and large in symbolism. It's small in military terms, it's not going to deploy divisions to Taiwan to fight a war. But it's large in terms of what it represents, a country trying to preserve peace through engagement on multiple sides, refusing to be shoved into a simple pro-West or pro-China box, and serving as a reminder that the security of the Taiwan Strait isn't just about two governments, it's about a whole region that depends on stable trade routes, economic cooperation, and diplomatic nimbleness. If conflict erupts there tomorrow or in the next few years, every country in Asia, including Singapore, will have to reckon with the consequences. The big picture is this: Asia's decades of relative peace have been underwritten by economic interdependence and diplomatic restraint. But where strategic interests clash, particularly over issues as existential as sovereignty and territorial control, that peace is always fragile. Singapore's decades-old cooperation with Taiwan is just one strand in a much larger web of relationships. If a crisis ever breaks out across the Taiwan Strait, how those relationships hold, or break, could determine whether history sees a limited conflict, a broader regional war, or, in the best of all outcomes, a negotiated path that keeps the peace without ceding the future of Taiwan to force. We do not know whether the war will start tomorrow, but one thing is certain: the clock is ticking.